Last thing we want to talk about in this chapter, dealing with descriptions of property, and I just got to tell you, this is a big deal in the actual practice of real estate. Now you got to know what kind of property or real estate you're actually selling. Okay, is there a difference between a condominium and a townhome? Yes. Is there a difference between a single family home and a prefabricated home? Yes. Or there's in all of this matters, and hopefully you'll see this as we go through. But when you go to list a property for sale, you've got to properly describe the property. I'm gonna tell you, if they think they're buying a condominium because that's the way it was marketed, and then somebody buys it, and then they find out it's not a condominium, it's actually a townhome. I'm telling you, there's some big differences between those two, and you could have some issues there. So you've got to be able to properly identify the right description of the property. So let's talk about some of the more common, and I'll tell you there are more than just what we're about to go over. But these are the most common, and obviously what you need to know for test purposes anyway. So we start out with the condominium. Well, first of all, what is a condominium? And I will tell you, if you actually go to Webster's dictionary and look up the term condominium, you'll find condominium just means airspace. So if you own a condo or condominium, all you own is air. That's it. That's a big deal. If I'm sitting in a condominium right now, which I'm not, but if I were sitting in a condominium, what I own is the air between this wall and that wall. You do not own the walls. You don't own the floor. You don't own the ceiling. All you own is air. So when you buy or sell a condominium, you're buying or selling airspace. That's all you're buying here. Now, it does say if you're going to own a condominium, you must own it in fee simple. Now, we just talked about all the different types of estates, right? Remember you can own real estate in fee simple or defeasible fee. Remember, defeasible fee means, defeasible means there are restrictions on what you can and cannot do with the property. Condominium style ownership is a form of joint ownership. There are typically multiple owners within one complex, or one building rather. You might have one building with 4 or 6 or maybe 8 different condominium units. So it's a form of joint ownership. Well, there's no way to put restrictions on one unit that would not have some effect or bearing on other units. So that's not going to be allowed. So if you're going to own a condo, it must be in fee simple, where there are no conditions or restrictions that would be attached to it. It also says here, if you own a condo, you cannot sell off common areas separately from the unit. I don't know why anybody would want to do that anyway. But, for example, maybe there's a pool, community pool, and obviously part of your regime fees when you own a condo might go towards the maintenance of the pool. Well, you might say, well, I don't go to the pool, don't want to go to the pool, don't like the pool, and I don't want to have to pay to maintain it and keep it up. So I'm just going to sell off just my share of the pool. You can't do that. You can't sell off common areas separately from the unit. In case you didn't know it, now you do. But the last thing you need to understand about a condominium, it says here, within 10 days of selling, and which is kind of strange to me. If I'm buying the property, I'd want this probably 10 days prior to selling. But it says here, within 10 days of selling, the owner must be provided with a certificate of assessment. And it's just a bunch of financial information about the condominium complex, about the regime, I will tell you, not only does the buyer need a copy of it, but typically before you even close, y'all, assuming you're financing it, the lender's going to want this. Okay, the appraiser is usually required to look into this, get this certificate of assessment, and get it to the lender, because typically the lender's not going to loan the money until they have this information. But y'all, there's a lot of stuff there. But y'all, things like, what percentage of the total units in this complex are owner occupied versus tenant occupied? And I will tell you, if you get to 50% or more of the units there are tenant occupied, you're gonna have a hard time getting financing for that. So I won't get into all the details to it, but this certificate of assessment is just information about the financials, if you will, concerning the condominium complex. But I would remember that within 10 days of selling, the owner must provide this to the buyer, so that they'll have this information. Okay, so that's your condominium. The next type of property is called a cooperative. A lot of times you just hear it called a co-op. Depending on where you live or what state you live in will kind of depend on some of the stuff will vary, I guess you might say. For example, here in the South, in South Carolina is where I am, condominiums are very common, very common. And there may be some co-ops around here, but I will tell you, I'm not familiar with them if they are. Co-ops are just not that common in my market. But you go to places like New York, for example, I expect co-ops are very common. Might be much more common than, say, condominiums. I guess it's just a preference thing. But there is a big difference when you start talking about a co-op. Now, when we talk about a co-op or cooperative, typically these like high-rise buildings, that could be 10, 20 stories high potentially, with units, living units, throughout the whole building. There could be a bunch of them, 50 units, 100 units, however many there are. But when you buy a co-op, what you're actually buying is stock in the corporation. So the entire building, let's say there's 50 units total in the building, multiple floors, but the whole building is the co-op. That's the cooperative. Well, when you buy stock in the co-op, then you're going to receive what they call a proprietary lease. Now, I would remember that term, proprietary lease. Well, what does that mean? Proprietary lease you means you have the right to live in or occupy one of the units, but you do not have to pay any rent. There's no rent involved with this lease. In fact, I will just tell you, if you see a question that deals with or even talks about having a proprietary lease, then you should know immediately that's a cooperative. There's a key word right there. But it kind of makes sense. Why would I have to pay rent for something that I own, right? But again, what do you own? All you own is stock in the corporation. So you don't own the building, you don't own the unit, you own stock. If you buy a condominium, it will be deeded to you. Just like really kind of like buying any other kind of real estate. But that's not the way it works with a co-op. What do you get as proof of ownership with a cooperative? A stock certificate. That's it. You're just buying stock in the corporation. So, there are some pretty significant differences, I would say, between a condominium and a co-op, right? Now, we'll tell you, just some other differences, just so you know. With a condominium, each unit can be individually taxed, individually mortgaged, and so forth. But that's not the case with a co-op, y'all. So when it comes to taxes, y'all, when the county sends out the tax bill, y'all, they send out the tax bill for the entire corporation, y'all, the whole building. Y'all, same thing with y'all. You can't mortgage a co-op, right? Y'all, because it's stock that you're buying. It's not your typical real estate. Y'all, same thing with insurance. Y'all, you cannot just get one unit in a co-op insured. Condo, you can't. Y'all, they're individually insured. But so how does that work with a co-op? Well, y'all, if you buy stock in the corporation, you get the proprietary lease, but then you're also paying regime fees, and part of that regime fee will include whatever your pro rata share of the total property taxes, insurance, stuff like that. Each owner will pay into that through the regime fee. That's how that works. Another type of property is called a townhome or townhouse. And I will tell you, this is where I see agents, they confuse townhomes with condominiums all the time. Well, they'll call it one and it should be the other. Because they don't know the difference between one and the other. And I will tell you, if you were just standing out at the street looking at the property, you probably would not know. This is something you got to look into and find out. Is this a townhome or is this a condominium? But with the townhome, it's usually like a row, one row of homes, but all attached. They're all attached to each other. So you could have 4, 5, 6 homes all attached in one row. Basically one building there. But with a townhome, you actually own dirt. You actually own the land that your townhome is sitting on. You actually own the walls and so forth. Remember, with a condo, you don't own any of that stuff. With a condo, all you own is airspace. That's it. But with a townhome, you actually own the walls. You actually own, not much, albeit, but you do own some of the ground, the dirt that it sits on. But, they all share common walls. Now, that is similar to a condo. With a condo, you could be sharing common walls, right? Because they're all attached. The difference is who owns those walls, right? So there's your difference between a townhome and a condo. The next type of property here is something called a PUD, or that's the acronym that you hear used a lot. A PUD. PUD stands for a planned unit development. And I will tell you, these are becoming very common. You're starting to see them pop up. They're everywhere now. But PUDs are they're kind of like the exception to the zoning laws. Typically, if you own land, all land is zoned to be used for a particular purpose, either for residential purpose or commercial or industrial, agriculture, whatever. And then whatever is zoned for, you have to use it in that way. Okay. But PUDs, they're somewhat an exception to that rule. Now, obviously, this has to be approved by the Planning and Zoning Commission. But once it's approved, basically the way it works is, you could have like a residential neighborhood or subdivision, but not only do you have residential homes in there, you got businesses in there. You could have, they may have your own schools inside there. Your own post office, doctor's office, you see attorney's office, they got businesses all in there. So you got all these different types of uses going on within the same neighborhood, both residential and commercial use. So that's sort of what they're talking about there with a PUD. Now, if you're financing or buying a house, and you're getting financing from the bank, the banks kind of look at PUDs a little bit different, and I don't know exactly how they may approach this, for exam purposes, honestly. or how big a deal it is for test purposes, but I just wanted you to know, here's how lenders kind of define a PUD. Obviously, the owner must own both the house, the residence, and the land. There is an HOA that maintains all the common areas. HOA membership is mandatory. You would have you have to pay your HOA dues. And for the most part, if all those exist, then as far as the lender's concerned, that's a PUD. Okay. Again, I don't know that it's that big a deal on how you define or why that matters for the lender. But that's just how lenders define a PUD. I think that's the main thing we need to know there. But then the next type now this one's kind of timeshares. This is a little bit different than typical real estate for sure. And I would assume most people are familiar with or at least heard of timeshares. But timeshare, it says this is like a property with multiple owners, and each owner will get to use the property for a certain amount of time throughout, say, a 1 year period. Might get to use it for 1 week out of the year or 2 weeks out of the year, and then other owners are using it the rest of the time. You're just basically sharing time. These are like vacation type properties, okay? But typically these are fully furnished properties with amenities like pools and stuff like that. But again, it's typically used for vacation type purposes. Now, there are different types of timeshares, okay? Here it talks about timeshare estates, which means you can actually own the timeshare. But then we're going to talk about here in a little bit something called timeshare use, which means you don't own the timeshare, but you have the right to use the timeshare from time to time. And we'll talk about those here in just a second. But right now, we're looking at timeshare estates. Now, again, remember, timeshare estates means you own the timeshare, okay? You have full ownership rights to be able to use it 1 week out of the year, or maybe 2 weeks out of the year, whatever your contract specifies. They list or talk about some of these ownership models, such as tenancy in common. It just means you get to, according to what you agree to in your contract, will determine how much time you get to use or stay in the timeshare throughout the year. That's all they're talking about there. But I would pay attention to that resale consideration. It says, so if you own a timeshare and you decide to sell it, it says these resale values often are 20 to 50% of the original cost. So there's some significant, excuse me, there's significant depreciation here. I don't know how else to say it, but you're going to lose money when you buy a timeshare because they depreciate quite significantly. So I'm not sure why people do it, but they do it. So there you go. But that's the timeshare estate, meaning you own it. Now, you also remember I said you could just decide to get a timeshare use. Basically like you're leasing the timeshare. So basically you're just signing a right to use the agreement. Now, you don't own it. You just have the right to use it. And again, depending on what you agree to in your contract, it will specify how much time, say in a year's time, that you get to stay or occupy the timeshare. Obviously the pricing is going to vary depending on the season, and it is flexible. Most of them are anyway, meaning that maybe the week that I'm designated to use the timeshare, I can't be there that week. So could I talk to someone that's going to be using it the following week and see if we can just swap and trade? Probably so. You could probably be able to do that. But then some other pieces of information about the timeshare. It says roughly 70% of the timeshares are owned. Are considered fee simple ownership, where 30% decide to go with the right to use. It's just some information there. Just know that appreciation would be very rare. You're not likely going to make any money. In fact, you're probably going to lose money when you go to resell the timeshare. So, I would pay attention. There are other things you need to be looking into as well, but I would think long and hard before I decided to spend money on a timeshare. And if I did buy a timeshare, if it's me, I'm not buying a new one. I'm gonna find somebody that's already spent all their money on it, and then I'll buy it from them for 50% of what they paid for it. Would be my preference. But I ain't buying one at all. So anyway, that's your timeshares. And then the last type of property is what we call the prefab or prefabricated homes. Now, this is a big deal here. If you're listing a house and it is a prefab home, you better make sure that's disclosed. Because now this can get you in a lot of trouble. But what is a prefab or prefabricated home? It's what it sounds like. Where they basically built or constructed the major components, the walls, floors, and stuff like that in a warehouse. Then they ship the components out to wherever the house is going to be located. Then they just put the pieces together. It's prefabricated. So it's not like you're building the house one board at the time. You're actually getting a wall at a time, and you just put them all together. And that's considered a prefabricated home. Now, probably one of the most common names for prefab, another term that they might try to use, or in fact might even ask you this on the exam. Modular homes. You hear that term used a lot. Modular homes are considered prefabricated homes. So if you have a modular home, you better make sure that's disclosed. If you indicate this is just a single family home or a stick built home, one board at the time, and then they find out later it was actually a modular or a prefabricated home, you could have some issues here. I'm telling you, I've seen agents get into a lot of trouble with this. So, it's just really important that you know exactly what you're selling and make sure you disclose that to the buyer. The buyer has a right to know what they're buying. And they also have a right to, if you tell them it's a prefab home or if it's a condo or a townhome, whatever you tell them, they have a right to base their decision making off of that. So, you got to be really careful with this. Pay attention. And I will also tell you, I would not just go by what the property owner tells you it is. Because I'm telling you, there are a lot of property owners, for example, think they bought a townhome for whatever reason, but the reality is they actually own a condo. You'd be surprised how many people own property, and they don't know what they own. So you need to verify this information because once you put it out there, you could be liable for it if it's wrong. So just be careful with that. Make sure you know what you're selling, and I think everybody would be happy. Okay?